All right, here we are. This is the first religion, tradition, whatever you want to call it, that we are going to be covering in Unit 2, the religions of the Far East. So that's going to include Shinto, Taoism, and Confucianism. Now, normally I'd be covering Shinto at the end of Unit 2. It's the youngest of those three traditions. We think it developed around the year between 300 and 500, and the texts that we have available for it, the sacred texts, the Kojiki, and the Nogiku, they were written between 500 and 700 CE. So again, the youngest of the three traditions, normally covered at the end, but since this semester I'm doing something a little different and I'm making it optional, you can either cover Shinto in your studies, or you can cover Sikhism. So if you did Sikhism, you don't need to be watching this, and you don't need to be doing the Shinto quiz. If you just want to watch it for your own enjoyment, your own interest, that's fine. We're not stopping you. I just want to let you know this is optional. So if you've already done Sikhism and you're one of my students, and you're strapped for time, you may want to move on to Taoism, which is coming up next. Okay, with all that out of the way, let's get started. This shouldn't be too long of a series. Shinto, it's a very short chapter in our textbook, and so I'm just going to give you a really brief overview. So this lecture should be just about the same length as the one on Sikhism, the one I just did earlier today. So without further ado, let's dive in. Okay, so here we have a map of the Japanese islands, the Japanese archipelago. Obviously, Shinto is the indigenous religion of Japan. It's always been a part of their history. There are no ancient texts, though, until writing is imported from China. Originally, Japanese had no word for this tradition, and in modern times, it's often associated with imperial power and worship of the emperor, which stopped at the end of World War II. We'll talk about that a little bit later. I've often heard the expression that in Japan, people are born Shinto and die a Buddhist. I know that's in one of the documentaries I gave you, but I've heard it elsewhere. You're born Shinto, you die a Buddhist. Many people celebrate. They have their weddings, special occasions at Shinto shrines. But when they need, something sad happens, a family member dies, funerals, they'll typically go to a Buddhist temple. So this is interesting about Japan. You can have people that, and even parts of other parts of the Far East, but typically Japan, it's especially interesting because you'll have three traditions. Some people will be Shinto, Buddhist, and they'll have some Confucian philosophy thrown in. So, but certainly Buddhism and Shinto go hand in hand in the Japanese culture. Although Shinto itself has become less of a religion, as far as I can tell, and more of just sort of part of their cultural heritage. It's a complex mix. Shinto is of shamanism and divination, hero worship, ancestor worship, and also animism. So if you don't know what shamanism is, perhaps you should look that up. But shaman, a holy wise person. One interesting thing about Shinto is many of the shamans. I always say shaman. I don't know which way is the right pronunciation. But the Shinto shamans a lot of them are women, typically women. They go into trances and they have visions. We'll talk about some of these figures later. But I mentioned the word animism. Animism is also a big part of their culture. Animism, the idea that all things, whether things that are sentient or other things that are animate or inanimate beings, are actually full of energy, right? So everything is animate, even a rock. That's the notion of animism. Some anthropologists, I've heard, ethnographers, they seem to think that this is the oldest form of religion that we know of. That if we trace back religion as far as possible, the oldest is some form of animism. Others argue it's ancestor worship. So I don't know. I don't think that's a question we could ever really know the answer to. Unlike some of these, in fact, I guess Hindus like this, but Jainism and Buddhism certainly are, and certainly Sikhism is not like this. But Shinto doesn't have a founder. So I guess Hindu doesn't have a founder either, unless you're talking about a particular tradition within the larger umbrella of Hinduism. So again, there's no orthodox canon either of sacred texts. There's no explicit code. There's not like a 10 commandments of Shinto. No ethical requirements. Even the meaning behind some of the elaborate rituals that are performed in the Shinto shrines are even unknown to the people who practice them. They've just been passed down for hundreds of years. This tradition is often also called Kami-no-michi, which literally means the way of the kami. The kami are the divine beings, okay? Their spirits are gods. They're sometimes found in animate or inanimate objects, right? There could be in animals or in buildings. They're spiritual forces which are thought to pervade the natural world, much like the devas that we saw in the Hindu tradition. The term Shinto literally means divine way or way of the divine being. Shin being divine being, to is one way of saying way or path or something like this. And as I mentioned earlier, I think I just mentioned them very briefly, the Kojiki and the Nihongi, these are the two major chronicles, you might call, of Shintoism. Uh, but most scholars agree that these books are not uniquely Japanese. They're definitely influenced by Buddhist, Confucian, Korean, and Chinese thought. The Kojiki is a record of ancient matters. There's lots of mythology in it. It involves the creation of the Japanese archipelago by Izanagi and Izanami, these two twins. Um, Izanagi is he who invites, and Izanami is she who invites. The textbook gives you a very clean version of this creation story. It talks about how they just, stabbed a spear into the ocean and pulled it out, and it created the islands of Japan. But it actually involves some incest, so I won't get into that. But you're free to do some research on that. So it's kind of controversial, but I suppose that it's okay for gods to sleep with each other if they're related because they're gods, so it's not the same. I know, like in Greek mythology, the gods, all the Olympian gods were all related. They were all brothers and sisters, but Hera and Zeus were married. And I think the Greeks, obviously, the Greeks didn't think incest was proper for humans, but I suppose it's okay for the divine. It's different. They're not flesh, so I guess it's not that bad. But anyway, I won't. I digress. Let's get back to the lecture at hand, right? So they're responsible for the birth of the island. They also bring forth the sun goddess Amaterasu. She is she's seen as the descendant of all the rulers of Japan. So all who descend from her rule the island. Um, the Kojiki itself is the text where a lot of this stuff comes from, is actually very this worldly, despite what you might think from what I've talked about so far. It doesn't really focus on an afterlife. There's descriptions of heavens and a netherworld, but they're very vague and they're very rare. The focus is primarily on enjoying life. There's a close link that is seen between gods, spirits, and humans. There's really no tension that you might find in other belief systems. Even in Christianity, there's this, and Judaism and Islam, the Abrahamic faith, there's this notion that, even though God is loving, there's always a struggle with God, a struggle with understanding and coping and knowing how to worship. But the Kojiki seems to imply that no, there's always this harmony. There really isn't a tension between them, but a close link. And human nature itself is essentially good, right? Sort of the opposite of the notion of original sin from Christianity, the idea that we're all born with sin, we're all born with sort of this evil nature, and we have to be saved. The opposite is the case for the Shinto faith, right? Human nature is good. Evil really only arises by polluting the spirit. So, ethics in Shinto generally follows Confucian lines. We'll talk about Confucianism in more detail when we get to that chapter. All humanity is the kamis, the gods, the spirit's child. So the will of the kami is to have sincerity, to be true of heart. So I guess the idea is that when you're impure and evil, you're not being true of heart. You're deceiving yourself. You're being deceitful, and you should just sort of look at your own heart, your own conscience, and then peacefulness and truth will come out. this is really thought of as such a peaceful religion, but the emperor obviously starts to make it more militaristic once we get into a more state-sanctioned nationalistic form of Shintoism, right, towards the beginning of the 20th century and, you know, the end of the 19th century. And they don't talk much about the history of this in the textbook, but they talk about, obviously, how the emperor at the end of World War II had to renounce his status as divine. And that put a big, you know, that was a big blow to the faith. But really, there are these, you know, so the idea was that the emperor himself was one of the kami, and that's no longer an article of faith. They're no longer supposed to. In fact, that was one of the. I'm jumping ahead here a little bit, but that was one of the stipulations in World War II when the Japanese surrendered. The emperor had to go on the radio and tell his people that he was not God, right? That he was not divine. And so, yeah, you can imagine how devastating that might have been to the faithful. But anyway, so there's a basic, I guess, ethos, right? There's not really a strict, rigid, you know, a code of ethics, but there are general 4 affirmations that you're supposed to follow within this tradition. You have to, you know, focus on the family. Family's important. Tradition and family. Love of nature, right? There's a close kinship with nature. You have to keep yourself physically clean, right? That's a big part of it, right? Personal hygiene and worship of the kami, right? Appreciation for all these elements and all these forces that are in nature and the world around us. So as I said, you know, there's this deep kinship with nature within Shinto. Mount Fuji is seen as a sacred site in this faith. Japanese cultures traditionally revered the symmetry and beauty that we find in nature, such as, you know, I don't know, like the, you know, Fibonacci sequence, etc. They seek a harmonious relation with nature. Ancient people supposedly lived so harmoniously with nature that they actually didn't have a separate word for nature until they actually began importing Western ideas. So, you know, there was no word for nature separate from society or civilization until about the 19th century when they started to encounter Western culture and Western writings. So their life was organized really around the seasons, and Mount Fuji again is honored as a sort of sacred embodiment of the divine creativity. It was believed that the islands were created from the sea, and this is the spot where, you know, Isunagi and Isunami pulled the spear, you know, stabbed the spear into the bottom of the ocean and pulled it out. Right, this is the peak that was lifted, and the islands sort of were created from this. The ocean itself and the rising sun were loved as earthly expressions of sacred purity at the heart of life. And even though, you know, you get all this industrialization that maybe overshadows the sort of worldview of Shintoism in Japan, you still can maybe think of things like Japanese gardens. If you live here in Houston, maybe you could go to like Herman Park and see some of these beautiful Japanese gardens with all the very symmetrically aligned stone paths and things like this. And there are various other natural habitats throughout Japan where people will visit, you know, for peaceful ceremonies, tea ceremonies. These are often linked with Zen Buddhism. We didn't talk about the tea ceremony when we were going over Buddhism, but that's an important ceremony to the Buddhist. And it's actually in the Buddhist documentary that I posted on D2L, the Land of the Disappearing Buddha. There's a scene in it where they do a tea ritual or a tea ceremony. So here's a picture of the Shinto shrines. I've got a lot more of these. We'll get to these in a second. But let's talk a little bit more about the kami, K-A-M-I, the spirits themselves and how they're honored. You know, the central religious activity in Shinto is worship, and a lot of it is done at these shrines. The function of it is to, I suppose, show gratitude and to secure favor with the gods. You may, you know, leave a blessing on you know, one of their next to one of their, you know, where they're thought to be inhabited. Usually it's not an image. Shinto's iconoclastic. They tend to, like Islam, you're not going to see pictures of saints and pictures of deities. You might, but that's not really, that's sort of frowned upon within the tradition. Again, they're iconoclastic. So icons, iconography, images, you know, of a person, if you're a Catholic, you might be familiar with the icons of saints, or if you're Orthodox Christian, you may be familiar with the icons in a cathedral. But Shinto again is iconography. They're iconoclast. But anyways, back to my point. Worship is thought to secure favor with the kami. So if you visit one of their shrines and leave charitable donations or something like that, and the form of worship can be public or private, right? The shrines are the public, but you can also there's also more private forms where a priest can visit your house and bless things, or you just prayer in your own home and you petition to a kami. You can give offerings like food and money. So the original deity apparently gives birth to the two Amatsu kami, the heavenly kami, and they were told to organize the material world. They also gave birth to humanity, or at least the ancestors of humanity. They stirred the ocean up with a jeweled spear, and when they pulled it out of the ocean, it dripped brine, which coagulated into the 7 islands, which are interpreted either as Japan, or some people interpret it as the entire world, all the continents. So to rule the earthly kingdom, they created Amaterasu. I should maybe back up here, right? So we're talking about these two figures here, Izanagi and Izanami, right? They're the Amatsu kami, right? They're the original who pull up the deep muck from the sea and make it into this beautiful island nation of Japan. And after them comes Kami Amaterasu, literally the one who illuminates the sky. She's the goddess of the sun. And again, the natural world is seen to be in a kinship with the spiritual creation of these deities. So the kami refers not just to these deities, but also to a quality, an essence, right? The word refers to a single essence that might manifest itself in many places. Okay, so the goddess of Amaterasu, she's the goddess of sunlight. And so perhaps she's just a force that whenever things are bright and sunny and looking forward, you're looking forward to things, Amaterasu is present. This is how many people still now regard the ancient Greek tradition, the pagan tradition. Some scholars, and I think this is very compelling, I kind of agree with them, they argue that the Greeks didn't literally believe that there was a guy with lightning bolts named Zeus that was, throwing lightning bolts down at us. But it was more of a personification of a natural force. So that might be a better way of understanding the kami. It's not that they're actually these images or these people we picture here, but they're rather a force of nature. They're forces in the actual natural world. And these are just images that symbolize, they're symbolic of them. So like I said, Shinto can be quite iconoclastic. So even these images here might be frowned upon, the ones I'm showing you of Amaterasu. And I really should slow down with the way I'm talking here because I don't speak Japanese, so I'm going to totally butcher these pronunciations. But Itsunami and Itsunagi, right? So the Shinto shrines, again, these are where a lot of the worship is done. They're built to honor the kami. The term kami literally means that which is above. It also refers to that which evokes wonder and awe. This sounds a little bit like what we were talking about in the first lecture in our intro to the class, that notion of the numinous, that which inspires awe. And the kami literally means that which is above. I actually think, again, I'm not an expert on this, but I think that the Greek word for gods is something similar, that which is above, or that which is not man, or higher than man, non-mortal, but eternal. Anyway, I digress. So the kami, you're supposed to harmonize heaven and earth. They reside, or whatever, this force or these beings reside in beautiful, powerful places, gardens, mountains. They manifest as wind, rain, thunder, lightning, and they also appear in these abstract forms, right? You might, creativity, an artist's creativity is inspired by the kami. Having a child, giving birth is an act of the kami, of the spirits. And since the 7th century, since the 600s, they used this idea of a mandate of heaven, which we haven't covered yet, but in Confucianism, the notion of a mandate of actually in Taoism, sorry, there's a notion of the mandate of heaven in ancient Chinese culture that links the imperial power to the divine, and so there's a similar notion in Shinto where makes the emperor himself one of the kami. Okay, so this is around the 600s. Um, Kanagara is known as the way of nature of the kami, and this is sort of the path, I guess. This is sort of what one tries. This is like it's the word for dharma, you might say, in the Japanese Shinto tradition. It's this notion of bringing our life into harmony with nature. So again, back to these shrines, right? They're built to honor all of these spirits, and there's more than 100,000 of these in Japan. Some of them are as small as beehives, and some of them are as elaborate as cathedrals. Some honor more local deities, just little local village kamis, and some honor kamis with special responsibilities. And the sites are thought to be chosen because they have a sort of a sacred atmosphere. Um, the greatest number of shrines are dedicated to Inari. So this is one of the kami, that he's associated with foxes, with rice, and the most shrines are dedicated to him. He's the god of rice. His messengers, again, they're foxes, and so you can always tell in Inari shrine. I thought I had, oh yeah, because they'll have these foxes out front guarding them, these statues of foxes. That'll sort of mark it off as an Inari shrine. There's other shrines, imperial shrines, right, that are more associated with the imperial power. Some of these are still kept up by the government and owned as part of like as national treasures, as historical monuments now. But obviously they had much deeper meaning before World War II. There's also shrines to Hashiman. That's another one of the kami. He's a kami of war. So here's a Hashiman shrine. I think I have a couple. No, I don't. Just that one. Tinjin or Tinjin, these shrines are to a scholar, right? He's supposed to be a very wise man, almost like the Japanese Confucius, right? He's not a god. He's just very wise, or maybe he represents all these wise people. But he actually was a real person who lived in the ninth century. Perhaps the most famous of the shrines in all of Japan is the Ise shrine. This is the most complex. It's a huge, it's more than one shrine. It's a huge a set of buildings, a complex of over 100 shrines, and it was built around the year 690. Its inner sanctum is only allowed to be entered by selected priests. So almost like the Holy of Holies in the temple, Jerusalem, the ancient temple. And it's thought to hold the sacred mirror. Okay, so the sacred mirror is believed to have been given to the very first emperor by the kami. It's sort of his mandate to rule over and to be considered a god. And it's considered so sacred that the general public is kept at a distance behind fences, and the entire compound is rebuilt brick by brick, I guess board by board, every 20 years. And it's thought that the sacred trees and the groves, that they were the earliest places of worship. So even if you can't get to a shrine, you can go to nature. So before there were these Shinto shrines, there are these holy places throughout the countryside, and they'll be marked by these torii. Okay, so the torii are these tall gate frames, walls, sometimes just a water, like a moat, and they kind of mark off or indicate these sacred spaces. You have to wash yourself or purify yourself before you're allowed to pass through these. Now, in the temple compounds, like the Ise Shrine, there's typically a public hall of worship that's located near the entrance, and behind that is an offering hall, and that's where priests will conduct rites, rituals. Beyond that will be some sacred sanctuary that can only be entered by a high priest. I think I have some photos here of some Shinto priests. Right, here we go. So the spirit of the kami is said to dwell within this spot, and usually it's within some object, usually a mirror. or maybe it could be a waterfall or some, some natural thing. To me, that seems kind of non-iconoclastic. I guess it's not an image of a person, but it's still a thing or an object. But anyway, some shrines are completely empty at the center. Worshippers are not supposed to focus on images. They're supposed to feel the presence of the kami. Remember, this is an iconoclastic tradition. So sometimes the worshiper doesn't even know which one of the kamis they're actually honoring. They just go there and they know there's some spiritual thing here, and I'm just gonna, I'm just gonna respect it, whatever it is. So the rituals are often really complex, and some temples require 10 years training to perform the ritual. So the priests, it's typically a hereditary position. It's passed down through the family. And the ceremonies are often assisted by mikos. So the mikos are these young unmarried women. They wear these white kimonos, and man, it was really hard to find these images on the Google search. The first semester I taught this class, I was looking for images of mikos, and everyone I got, they were all naughty. They were all not safe for work. Apparently there's a lot of X-rated fantasy stuff out there. So I was at work on campus looking at this stuff, and I was like, oh crap, I don't want to get in trouble and get fired for looking at inappropriate stuff. But these are images of actual mikos, not Japanimation porno versions of them, right? But again, they assist the priest, and they're supposed to be ascetic, right? They're supposed to be virgins, unmarried, and neither the priest or priestesses are absolutely ascetic, though. They're just specialists in rituals, right? But these women are supposed to be pure. There's a description of the rituals on page 230, and it's quite elaborate. So I'm going to read, this is a pretty long passage here. I'm going to read how they describe some of the Shinto rituals, and then we'll talk a little bit about purification after I read this long passage. So this is in the textbook on page 230 if you have the 10th edition. I think if it's the 7th edition, which I told some of my students they could get, I think it's on 219. But it starts, everything has symbolic importance. So rites are conducted with great care. The correct materials and temple furnishings, the bowing, the sharp clapping of hands, beating of drums, the waving of a stick with paper strips for purification. Everything is established by tradition and performed with precision. When people have made a pilgrimage to a special shrine, they often take back spiritual mementos of their communion with the kami, such as a paper symbol of the temple encased within a brocade bag. The sale of such amulets is a major source of shrine income, along with payments for the performance of special prayers and rites. Japanese people may also make daily offerings to the kami in their home. Their place of worship usually consists of a high shelf on which rests a miniature shrine with only a mirror inside. The daily home ritual may begin by greeting the sun in the east with clapping and a prayer for protection for the household. Then offerings are placed before the shrine: rice for health, water for cleansing and preservation of life, and salt for purification and the harmonious seasoning of life. When a new house is to be built, the blessings of the kami are ceremonially requested. Another common feature of Japanese popular culture is that is associated with shrine worship is festivals, which are held throughout the year and throughout a person's life. They begin 4 months before the birth of the baby, when the soul is thought to enter the fetus. Then, 32 or 33 days after the infant's birth, the parents take it to the family shrine for initiation by the deity. In a traditional family, many milestones, such as coming of age at 13, or first arranging one's hair as a woman at age 16, marriage, turning 61, 71, or 81, are also celebrated with a certain spiritual awareness and ritualism. And it goes on, talks a little bit more about the special festivals. But as you can see, there's a lot to this, and it gets pretty complicated. Often the daily offers are made to kami in home. That I just mentioned that was in the passage I just read. The festivals again they're described in more detail there on page 230. But there's many commemorating many occasions. Okay, now when it comes to purification, this is a big part of the tradition. Remember that you have to keep yourself pure, clean, hygienic, etc. The quality of impurity or bad luck, misfortune, is called tsumi, and it arises from defilement by corpses, menstruation, hostility towards others. If you get angry and you're in a bad mood and you're just really pissed off, or if you're hostile towards the environment or towards the society, whenever there's a natural catastrophe, these could all be causes of impurity or tsumi, and it calls for purification. Emphasis is really not on repentance, feeling sorry, but somehow seeking purification. There are ritual impurities that offend the kami, and many bring about bad luck. Um, Sexuality per se is not evil. The world was created by these mating deities, and they were actually related. But ritual impurity is another issue. So, how do we remove impurity? Well, one of the ways is this gentleman here in the photograph is performing misogi, which is the removal of tsumi. Okay, by standing under a waterfall, right? Purification under a waterfall. But the general sort of, I guess, stage that you have to go through is you have to pay attention to problems as they arise. There's a saying that problems in the morning have to be solved in the morning, and problems in the evening have to be solved in the evening. So don't let it fester. Don't let that animosity keep building. You have to purify everything. You have to purify yourself in a spontaneous movement that washes over yourself. So it's often something in nature, like the waterfall here. And it brings you into an awareness of unity with the universe. Okay, so this is one ritual that can sort of, I guess, make you forget about your troubles, or sort of, I guess you get so submerged in the physical experience that it allows you to chill out. It's very meditative, I suppose. So there are ritual forms of purification, like misogi, are often also used. So oharai is another one of them. Oharai, and I have a lot of pictures of oharai rituals here, is one. The guy, obviously, with this stick and the feathers, with the streamers, he's a priest, and he's performing the oharai ritual, this purification ritual. So he's waving this branch from a sacred sakaki tree, with the streamers attached. It purifies the air. And the ceremony is often performed on buildings and on cars, right? So if you get a brand new car for good luck, I suppose. And again, I already mentioned the misogi, the purification by waterfall. Also sprinkling salt on the ground or on a person before entering a Shinto shrine. Often worshipers will do this, or they'll splash water on their hands and face, rinse their mouth. So in your textbook, it talks a bit about Buddhist and Confucian influences. We've already talked and covered about Buddhism, but we haven't said much about Confucianism. So hopefully this won't be too confusing for you if you're doing this, if you're covering Shinto and you haven't got to Confucius yet. But I'm going to keep my comments pretty brief here, and then we'll talk about the different forms of Shintoism, and then wrap things up. We're getting pretty close to the end of the lecture here. So again, Buddhism is, as I said earlier, it's often practiced side by side with Shinto. They have very disparate theologies, and they're applied to different situations and problems. As I said, Shinto is more like a life-affirming faith, so it is usually invoked at more life-affirming events, at conception, birth, marriage, etc. Buddhism is usually used when at funerals. Medieval Buddhist monks actually argued that the kami were equivalent to the Buddhist deities that you see in some of the Chinese and Tibetan Buddhist traditions. And some villages actually have statues of kami and statues of Nichiren, right? Remember the Nichiren Buddhists from the previous lecture? And they'll be placed side by side. So kami and Buddhist shrines often cohabitate together in natural environments of Japan, like in mountains, for example. And pilgrims on the way to these shrines will often chant Buddhist scripture on their journey to Shinto places. So as for Confucianism, most scholars in Japan around the 16th century, they likened the notion of Li, which we'll get to when we talk about Li. They thought that was the same thing as the way of the Kami, right? So Li is an important notion. It's sort of like the right disposition or approach in Confucianism. They saw that as the same thing as the way of the Kami. It's a means of social cohesion. So there's a combination of the Confucian emphasis on a hierarchy and also a devotion to Kami, and this helped to pave the way for an establishment of the Michi dynasty in 1868, which is mentioned in your textbook, and sort of the rise of what's known as state Shinto. So state Shinto, again, it's at the beginning. I should have written all this down. I don't have Meiji, but it's Meiji is how it's Latinized. So the Meiji regime, they promote Shinto as a spiritual basis for government. The emperor was apparently the offspring of Amaterasu, the sun goddess, and the way of the Kami was supposed to govern the nation. So government officials, not priests, were the ones that regulated the religion. Many of the old rituals were actually suppressed, and Shinto becomes much more materialistic. But again, as I mentioned earlier, after World War II, the emperor was forced to declare himself human and no longer a god. And so state Shintoism is no more. Sect Shintoism is perhaps what remains, really, of Shintoism today. Besides just the shrines as national treasures, the sect Shinto, there are still some sects, some smaller, more specialized forms of Shintoism, and these were thought to actually have developed out of a female shamanistic tradition. So the Kami would speak through these female shamans, and many of these shamans gained followings, and they developed different traditions. Some movements are still popular today, right? Tenriko is one that is still fairly popular in Japan today. I mean, it's not huge. I would say in general, Japan is a fairly secular nation. But again, Miki Nagayama, she is considered the founder of Tenriko. She's one of these female shamans, and apparently she composed 1,711 poems under divine inspiration. Now, Madame Noguchi is the founder of another one of these sects, Umoto, and it developed from revelations that she apparently received from a very little known kami named Ushitora no Konjin. I don't know anything about him, right? But this is one of the kamis who apparently delivered messages to Madame Noguchi, the founder of Umoto. And the writings of her, they tend to emphasize the problem of the strong exploiting the weak. It sort of almost reminds me of the Sermon on the Mount in the Gospels in the New Testament, right? The meek shall inherit the earth, and look out for your fellow man and don't exploit. Shrine Shintoism is not mentioned by Fisher, but you might say that this is sort of what replaces state Shintoism. It's what develops into state Shintoism, and then after the fall of the emperor and the sort of humanizing of the emperor after World War II, state Shintoism returns back to shrine Shintoism. Folk Shintoism, also mentioned in your textbook, they don't say much about it, but folk Shintoism has no formal organization. In fact, it's not really a group, it's just different traditions developing independent of the sort of more organized forms of Shintoism. So it's almost like when we talk about Taoism, you'll see how what we call philosophical Taoism, or I think in the textbook they call it literati Taoism. This is sort of what most Westerners think of as Taoism, but what we also call Taoism in the textbook, I don't think most people practicing it would call it Taoism. It's really just a folk religion of China and Vietnam and Cambodia and Laos and all these places where Buddhism and spread and Taoism spread, and really just local religions and local traditions sort of morphed with it. Same thing in Shinto, right? You've got what's called folk Shinto, and so you might go to some village and they'll be practicing what looks like Shinto, but quite different with their own deities, their own special rituals. And again, it developed independent of this sort of more organized ecclesiastical order. Outside of Japan, Shinto really doesn't have much of a following, and as I think I mentioned earlier, it's really becoming smaller and smaller as a tradition, and you might even say it's an endangered species in a certain sense, right? There are a few Shinto shrines outside of Japan. There's some in Hawaii. There's some in Brazil where Japanese people have settled. Um, so after World War II, like I said, the Shinto is de-emphasized, and it's associated actually with imperialism, but the shrines are still maintained by the government. And that's kind of controversial. I've had a lot of people write papers about that in their research paper before in previous semesters. I hope you guys don't do that. There were like 5 of them. You know, there must be like some article, a lot of stuff written about this because it's pretty controversial. But anyways, that's all I had to say about Shinto. It's a fascinating tradition. I'm not a huge fan of anime, but I know my students are. A lot of my students are. Yeah, it's just, I guess I'm just, that was, it's just, it's not, it was after my time. I think Dragon Ball Z was really big when I was about 19 or 20. It started getting real big, and I just wasn't that into it. I really liked American animation. I was just kind of used to that style. I never really got into it, and I know that there's certain if you watch a lot of Japanimation, I don't remember the guy's name. I should burn it to memory, but I've never seen any of his films. He made a movie called Spirited Away. He's a very famous Japanimation director. He's supposed to make some really good films, and apparently a lot of his movies are influenced by Shinto, the Shinto tradition. And you see, especially Spirited Away. My sister is a big fan of his. She always tells me I should watch it and give it a shot. So one day I'll sit down and watch it. But anyways, I'm rambling, so I better shut up. Our next series is going to be Taoism. I'm going to see if I can get it all wrapped up into one video, but probably not, because I love philosophical Taoism so much that I probably will get beefy with that. So it might be a 2-parter. And then after that's Confucianism, and that'll be it for Unit 2. Those are the only traditions that we're going to be looking at in Unit 2, the religions of the Far East. So thanks a lot for sticking around to the end of this video, and I hope you enjoyed it. Hope you stick around for the next one in the series. Again, Taoism's coming next, and again, I'll see you on the other side. Cheers.